12 million people who were enslaved, we know nothing about them. What's unique about the Clotilda story is when it happened. So the ship arrived in Alabama in July of 1860. At this point, it had been illegal to import Africans or anyone else, enslave them in the United States for over 50 years. So because of this, by the time of the Civil War, almost everyone who was enslaved in America had been born in America. There were very few people left who had experienced the Middle Passage or known what life in Africa was like by this time. So with the Clotilda story, we get this sort of time capsule of what happened the previous 400 years to people. And we hear it all from the mouths of the people involved. So 10 of the Clotilda survivors were interviewed in 1913 for a book that came out in 1914. So from their mouths, we have what their lives were like before they were captured. We have what it was like to be the victim of an African slaving raid. We know what their time in the Barracoons were like. We hear the Middle Passage from their mouths, and then their time as enslaved, and then we know what happened to them after. And they started a town in Alabama called Africatown that is still there today, where their descendants live. And we also have the story from the white enslaver side. So there is no other story in the history of the slavery era where we have all of this information. So that's why the Clotilda is important. We are going to hear from the mouths of the people involved. And that's the only story we've got that is so detailed. Now, these are three of the people that we actually have the interviews from. And the first one here is Cudjo Lewis, who is the most famous. He was the last survivor of the group that started Africatown. He actually lived until 1935. He was interviewed dozens of times, most famously by Zora Neale Hurston, who came to Alabama and interviewed him in 1927 for the book that became Barracoon, although it languished in the archives of Howard University until 2018 when it was finally published. And we got this incredible resource. Next guy is Charlie Lewis, who is not related to Cudjo Lewis, but was also on the ship and was one of the rulers of Africatown. And then over there we have Gumpa, or Peter Lee, who was the first chief of Africatown. And we'll hear a little more about him as we go on. But I want you to connect the story with these people. They were sitting in a cabin they had built in a country they were taken to and abandoned in, or marooned in, and they're telling their story 60-some years later. It is quite remarkable. And then this guy is Timothy Mayer. This is the Alabama steamboat captain who funded and caused the whole Clotilda trip. He paid for everything. And, the story begins with Timothy here. We always hear that the Clotilda story started with a bet. And this is the guy that made the bet. And it did start with a bet. Timothy Mayer moved to Alabama in 1835 as a young man, right after Andrew Jackson had taken all the Indians, the Creek tribe. When we hear about the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma, those were Alabamians. They were Alabama natives who were marched away. So this guy swept in with a wave of people that came in the 1830s when Alabama was the frontier. Mississippi was still wild at that point, not settled. So he arrived, he worked as a deckhand on a steamboat. Flash forward 30 years to 1860, he and his brothers, who also came down from Maine, they're the equivalent of millionaires in today's money. They own 9 steamboats, they own lumber mills, they have 3 plantations. Between them, they enslaved 50 people. So they were very well off. Their business was moving cotton down the rivers to the port at Mobile, which was at the time the 3rd biggest port in the United States after New York and New Orleans. So this was a cosmopolitan, wealthy city at the time, which if you've been to Mobile lately, it's changed. So Timothy is on his boat. The rich passengers, they eat dinner in the salon. And this is, think antebellum, Gone with the Wind, serious wealth. There was a group of passengers on the boat, and after dinner, they went out to drink whiskey on the deck and talk and smoke cigars. And so they're talking about the news of the day, which at this time was a story of a ship called the Wanderer that came into Georgia, again with an illegal load of enslaved Africans. And those people, there were about 400 of them, there were 378, I think, were spread around the South. And we know some of them arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, and then Mobile, Alabama, because a New York Times reporter in Montgomery encountered the Africans on this train and wrote about them going to Mobile. So the guy that sent that ship was named Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, a great Georgia name. He was a total ne'er-do-well. His parents were wealthy, and they had funded his various endeavors. He tried road building, horse racing, gold mining, failed at everything. So then he decided to become an illegal slave dealer. And he sent this ship, he outfitted it in New York, where many slave ships were outfitted, even up into the 1860s. Outfitted this ship, sent it to Africa, came back with these people. After the ship came back, he got arrested and charged with illegal slaving, which was a crime punishable by death, and it had been since 1808 when Thomas Jefferson signed a law that made it illegal. But the reason he was doing it was the massive price difference. You could buy a person in Africa for about $50 US at the time, which would be worth 30 times that much today, and sell that person in the South for close to $2,000 in that money. So he was looking at this as a money-making thing. Anyway, he gets caught. They're talking about the case on the boat in Alabama because it was in all the newspapers all over the country, the story of the Wanderer and whether these men would be hung. And we know it was in all the papers because in court, Charles Lamar actually challenged a Navy Commodore to a duel, as well as the editors of the New York Times and the New York Tribune, because their papers he thought were unfavorably covering what he had done. He and the Navy Commodore, incidentally, they stopped court, they went out in the street and shot at each other, and both missed. They went back in, and the court case continued. So Timothy Mayer, they're talking about it. One of his passengers is a Yankee. He's a guy from New York. There's another one from Rhode Island. And they're talking about it, and the New York guy says, well, I think they should hang the lot of them to scare anyone else away from doing this. And Timothy says, nonsense, they'll hang nobody. I could go to Africa and do it myself and bring back a load of slaves. And they make a bet. And he bets $1,000, which is the equivalent of $30,000 in today's money, that he could do this. And the other guys, think, but he did say no one would be hung for it. That's exactly what happened with the Wanderer case. No one was hung. No one was charged at the end of the case. The only person who spent a day in jail related to bringing in those 400 people was Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, because during the trial, he went to the jail with guns and a bunch of his buddies, and they broke the captain of the ship, of the Wanderer, who had sailed to Africa out of jail, to come to a party at a hotel. And when the sheriff and people showed up to take him back to the party, they said, we'll bring him back in the morning. So after the trial was over, Charles got fined $250 and 30 days of home confinement. That was the only penalty anyone associated with the Wanderer ever suffered. No one in America in the 50 years it had been illegal had ever been hung for slaving, despite the fact that every president between Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln had pardoned convicted slavers who were caught red-handed. Now, all those presidents also enslaved people, so I think they felt like, well, I can't, I'm doing the same thing. Abe Lincoln felt differently and became the first and only president to hang someone for illegal slaving. The person he hung was caught 3 weeks before the Clotilda arrived back in America. So these guys were facing real peril for what they were doing because there was this anti-slaving squadron. So this is the guy Timothy Mayer sent to Africa. He was his neighbor. This is Captain William Foster, and Foster lived in a rooming house. He was not a wealthy man on the same creek where Timothy Mayer's plantation was. But Foster was a guy from Nova Scotia whose family were shipbuilders. And so he was building ships down here on the Gulf Coast. And they were really good ships. They were very fast. And so he had 4 or 5 ships at this point. Now, a ship like the Clotilda, which looked like this, a 2-masted schooner, was an 18-wheeler of the day. This is how goods moved around both in the country and from abroad. We didn't have the interstate system. So the Clotilda, in the 5 years before it went to Africa, had been to Mexico, had been to Central America, had been to the Caribbean, and the manifests show us it would sail away loaded with Alabama wood, so live oak and pine and cypress, and come back with oranges, sugar, rum, things like that. So it was just a cargo ship, but it was the fastest one around. Because Foster was really good at his craft, he had sheathed it in copper, which made it faster. Now this becomes important later when we're trying to identify the ship. And he had extra sails. So this was a fast boat, but it was by no means a boat for transatlantic crossings. It had a retractable keel. the centerboard that hangs down, which is for stability in big ocean crossings. But they had it retractable on the Clotilda so that it could get into the shallow coastal bays. Any of you familiar with the Mississippi coast, Alabama coast, Louisiana coast know it's all about shallow coastal bays. So with the keel up, the ship would only draw 4 feet of water. So Mayer went to Foster and said, hey, I've got a job for you. I want to hire you to do this illegal thing and risk your life and become a pirate. And he said, I'll pay you handsomely. He said he would give him $35,000 for doing it, which multiply that times 30, so we're talking about $500,000. You get to keep the ship after, and the ship was worth $500,000. And I'm going to give you 10 of the captives you bring back. Now, those people were worth about $2,000 a piece back then in Mobile. And they were, in today's money, we're talking about $60,000 a piece. So here is another $500,000. So he's going to go from living in a rooming house to being a millionaire. Foster is. So that's his impetus for doing it. Incidentally, then they had to pick where they were going to go. And luckily, the Mobile newspaper came to the rescue. I used to work at this paper. In fact, I worked at it when I found the ship. It's the Mobile Press Register. So they're saying, well, where do we go to get Africans? The Press Register runs a little article, an international news event, that says King Gizu, who you see here, is back in the business of selling people. He had temporarily gone out of the slaving business at the behest of the English, who said, we will buy so much palm oil from you, you won't need the income from selling people anymore. After 2 years, Gizo was like, yeah, they're not buying enough palm oil. I want to sell people again. So he started back. The newspaper article says people can be had in Ouida, that's the main port in modern-day Benin, for $60 a piece. And so they're going to sail to the Dahomey Empire, and that is this guy. So the Dahomey Empire is one of the most bloodthirsty regimes in world history, and we're going to talk about it for a bit. This is an entire society built solely on the business of capturing Africans and selling them. And this went on there for about 300 years. And the way to think of Dahomey is, modern day Benin, which is where Dahomey was. Modern day Benin is about the size of Mississippi. Everybody who was on the Clotilda, all of the prisoners who were from multiple tribes, were all captured in modern day Benin by this tribe, the Dahomeyans, now known as the Fan. So picture Mississippi, and then picture Jackson. And Jackson, and its city limits, that's the Dahomey kingdom. And so for 300 years, the Dahomey kingdom went around the rest of Mississippi, if we're using this analogy, capturing people. That's about the geographic area we're talking about, which becomes important as we move ahead. So Foster sails there. His crew mutinies 3 times on the way there because they figure out that they're becoming pirates without being asked. Foster sails the ship into a hurricane and nearly sinks it, breaks the boom off and the rudder. Apparently he had been building ships but not driving ships. He had multiple captains working for him. This trip in the Clotilda was the first trip in the 5 years of the Clotilda's existence where he was listed as the captain. They pulled into Porto Playa in the Caribbean to do repairs to the ship because the hurricane crippled it so badly they couldn't travel across the ocean. And the crew figured out, okay, we see because he'd covered all the supplies in the ship with wood to hide them, with stacks of lumber. So the crew thought they were delivering lumber. Right up until after the hurricane, an anti-slaving squadron came up behind them, the vessel, and Foster said, put up sails, we're running, which tipped the crew off that we're not going to let the police come and check the ship. And so they get to port, they find all the supplies, because to move people across the ocean for 2 months, you've got to have a ton of water, you've got to have meat, you've got to have food for them. And so the crew found all that, and they mutinied again in the port. Foster says, I'm going to double your wages. And then he says in his journal, they busily went back to work. So they leave that port, and Foster runs into one of the anti-slaving squadron ships that is at anchor in the port and rips the main sail off the ship. The boom catches on the Clotilda. I mean, this is bad boat driving. As a captain, I'm telling you. So by the time they get to Benin, King Gizu, we saw, is dead, and King Glele, his son, is alive. To understand a little bit of how murderous Glele was, when he died, when Gizu died, a year later, Glele threw a party. So Benin, Dahomey, you have to understand, is the source for the Vodun religion, which is the parent religion of all the voodoo forms we're familiar with. So Louisiana's voodoo, Mississippi, the Caribbean voodoo, Brazil, that all comes from Vodun, that arrived in our part of the world in the bodies of captives from Benin. So as part of the Vodun religion, just like the voodoo offshoots, sacrifice is an important component. And in this case, they sacrifice people. So to honor his dead father on the 1-year anniversary of his death, Glele, this guy, had 250 people ritualistically sacrificed. And they killed them slowly, they cut them, they let them bleed and scream, and they had this huge party for days. They called it the annual custom, and they did this every year. They still do it in Benin today, in January, if anybody wants to go. They no longer kill people, but you don't want to be a dog or a cat around there. So this is one of the warrior women of the Dahomeyans. There's a new movie coming out called The Warrior Women or Warrior Princess or something like that. It stars Viola Davis. It is based on these women. So are the warrior women of Wakanda, for any of you who saw Black Panther. It's taken straight from this, which is actual true history. So in Dahomey, there was a king who had a twin sister. And the king died. And his sister said, well, I'm going to become king and pretend to be him, because they looked a lot alike. And so she gathered around her all the women she knew and liked and said, you guys are my new secret guard, to keep her secret that she was a woman. So there weren't any men around. And these women became more and more fierce during her reign, and their ranks grew. And so she soon had this elite troop of these women who were trying to best men at everything. So she dies. The next king is so impressed with this group of warrior women, he makes them a permanent part of the Dahomeyan army. So the Dahomeyan army, when they would go attack somewhere, they would march with 50,000 people. Now think about that, 50,000 people. And they were armed with guns. You see she's holding a gun because they traded with all the European nations. And so they had tons of money. If you remember how Gizu was dressed, that big hat, the big umbrella, those beautiful fabrics, that's all European fabrics that are being traded with the Dahomeyans. So these women, when they would attack a village, these were the shock troops that went over the walls. And you see the walled compound? This is how all the kingdoms in Africa were. They were fortified. So the men would surround the village, this 50,000 group of men, to cover all the gates, so that when the people who were being attacked came running out, the men would catch them. But the women went over the wall in the dead of night and started breaking into houses and murdering people. Now, Cujo talks about the house he grew up in. The door didn't have a lock. It didn't have hinges. You just picked the door up and moved it out of the way and went inside. And then you put it back when you were inside. So he talks about in Barracoon waking up to these women running through town, cutting off his neighbors' heads. Now, the way the Dahomeyans attacked, they killed everyone who wasn't of slaving age. So if you were younger than about 12 or older than about 30, they killed you. This is one of the costs of slavery we can't really know, and we lose track of, I think, a lot in the stories. The Dahomeyans for 300 years did this. When they attacked a village, they killed everyone they didn't take, so there was no one left behind to come after them for revenge, and they could add to their empire and have all these ghost towns they didn't have to police because there were no people in it. So Cujo talks about this. If we think of the people who were captured, the 12 million people who were captured over the years, think of how many tens of millions of people were left behind dead in these various villages. You know, when we talk about the toll on Africa, it's not just the people who were stolen, it's the people who were killed and left there too. So we talked about the warrior women already. We can learn a little about how scared the people of modern day Benin were of the Dahomeyans from what's left there today. And one of the things is this place. This is Ganvi. This is called, well, some people call it the Venice of West Africa. This is a tribe called the Tofinu. In 1704, they knew they were probably next on the Dahomeyans' hit list because the Dahomeyans were ever expanding out. And so they also knew the Dahomeyans would not attack after traveling over water because in the Vodun religion, many of the gods and things are sea serpents, snakes and things like that. So it was considered, it was taboo. You did not cross water before battle. So the Tofinu in 1704 moved out into the middle of Lake Nakui, which is on the outskirts of Cotonou, Benin's biggest city, and built a village on stilts. And today there are 50,000 people living in that same village, same tribe. Today they farm, they do aquaculture. They raise tilapia and other fish in pens under their houses, around their houses. Incidentally, this green plant here you see, that's from the Amazon. We have that plant here. You'll see it in Mississippi swamps, Alabama, Louisiana. And I was here and I was looking at it and I was saying, why is all that water hyacinth here? It belongs in the Amazon. And then I thought, oh, well, they've been trading with Brazil for 400 years, moving people. So it got there, honestly. But the village was fascinating. Here, this is where they get their drinking water, this little hut here. You see all the boats lined up. Look how expansive it is. I mean, there are hotels, there are restaurants. This is actually a little drone footage of the village. This is a hotel here. It was an extraordinary place, for sure. A couple more shots of it. This is the school. They built an island for the school so the kids would have a soccer field, which is what you see right there. That big boat, that's the school bus. And here are the kids on the school bus. We know other ways, through other things that are in modern-day Benin, about how scared they were of the Dahomeyans as well. There are more than 1,000 underground villages in Benin. And these are places where the people would come out and farm the land and hunt and stuff in the daytime, and then at night, they went down into caves they had dug, and they slept underground, and they cooked underground. They were hiding from the Dahomeyans at night when they knew the Dahomeyans would attack. So think about that. I think there are 1,800 underground villages that they've found so far. You know, pretty extraordinary. This little 5-year-old kid paddling this 25-foot-long canoe, and he was just moving out, no problem. So now we're back with Cudjoe. You know, what I was talking about with the Dahomeyan women are coming over the walls and all, that's all in Barracoon. Cudjoe talks about all these things. And he talks about how his village was betrayed by someone from the village who knew the secret of the gates. He talks all the time about the secret of the gates. Well, the secret of the gates in Cudjoe's village, which was a big market town with a king and everything, the secret of the gates was that there were 8. And so if the raiders came in one gate, you'd run out one of the others. But the Dahomeyans were informed and knew where they were. This is the palace in Dahomey. It used to be covered in all kinds of art, but the French stole it, but they're giving it back. So Cudjoe and the others were marched here. After they captured people, they took them to Dahomey and interviewed them. If they had skills, like you're a cook, a baker, an artist, they kept you. If you didn't, like Cudjoe was being trained as a warrior, they sold you. So they were just kind of taking the cream of the crop. This is a picture of a modern-day Fan person. I want you to notice the facial scarifications, which becomes very important in modern-day Benin. This is the old slave road. About 4 million people, about 1/3 of all people who were enslaved, marched down this road because they were captured by the Dahomeyans. And this road's about 60 miles long, goes from Dahomey to the coast, and it's well-traveled today. You see the coconut palm there. The other trees out in the distance are mango trees, papaya trees. Cudjoe talks in Barracoon about he and his siblings, he had 18 of them with 3 mothers, would run through the woods smelling for fruit on the breeze and have games for whoever could find the pineapple the fastest and things like that. It's a beautiful country. This is the tree of remembering. They would march every captive around this tree 3 times. Now remember, the Dahomeyans, Vodun, they're very worried about ancestors. They're very worried about, people haunting them from the past. They marched everyone around this tree 3 times so that their souls would remember how to get home when they died. So their souls wouldn't be locked in whatever country they were being deported to by the Dahomeyans. And this is one of the Barracoons. All the big slaving nations, Holland, England, France, Spain, Portugal, had barracoons. Barracoon is just a Spanish word for fort. So these countries built purpose-made forts, prisons, to house captives that were destined for them, so that their traders could show up in Ouida, in Benin, and deal just with people speaking their language. It was a way to facilitate the movement of people as fast as possible. So we know how busy the Dahomeyans were with capturing people from as early as the 1600s. There's a book called Diary of a Dutch Slave Trader from 1619. In 1619, he writes that in most African ports, you could get 3 or 4 people in a week. And he says in Ouida, you could get 1,000 people in a few hours. And this is Captain Foster's experience when he goes there. He is taken to one of the barracoons, and he says there are 4,000 people in there waiting to be sold. I mean, this is an industrialization. This entire economy was built solely on capturing fellow Africans and deporting them. So here we are on the ship. This is what the Clotilda would have looked like. That's what the hold was like. There's a tragic story in, I think it's in Barracoon or it's in one of Cudjo's interviews. Foster has picked out the people he wants. They're chained together. They're waiting in this coffle outside this building. Foster goes in to pay. Timothy Mayer had sent him with 27 pounds of gold. So Foster's inside handing over his gold. And somebody comes and unties Cudjo from the line of people. He's still bound, and they push him under the house, into a crawl space under this white frame house, and tell him to wait there. And so he sees all the feet march away, and his group is led away, people that he was captured with from his village and things. And he can hear the ocean. The whole time they were in the Barracoon, which was for about 3 weeks, they could hear the ocean, but they couldn't see it over the walls. So he's under the house. He's hidden. He's not with the people being taken away. And he tells Zora Neale Hurston, but I wanted to see what makes that roaring noise, meaning the waves on the beach. So he climbs out from under the house, and he peers over the wall. And he can see the ships, first time he's ever seen the ocean. He can see the waves, and then he sees everybody that he was tied up with. And he sees his friend Kibi, who he grew up with. And he says, I want to go with Kibi. So I holler out, hey, don't forget me. And so they come get him and take him down there. He could have run away. He could have hid under the house. I imagine he was peeled off because there was probably a guard there who stole a person from every transaction, because they were worth money. But it's just this poignant moment where he knows his whole family's been killed. He knows his village has been destroyed. And he decides it's better to go get on that boat to be sent across the ocean because he can still be with Kibi, who incidentally lived in Africatown, and he knew, the rest of his life. So here we are in the ship. In the ship, the people are naked. They are, when you see those images of slave ships with the people laying down in a horseshoe shape all the way around and crammed together, those ships were designed to carry 1,000 to 2,000 captives. The Clotilda was a cargo ship. It wasn't designed like that. So they had the people in the hold in groups of 8, chained around the neck to rings in the floor. They had hoped to bring as many as 175 people back. So they had plenty of food on the Clotilda, which was unusual among slave ships. They only ended up with 110. Foster had actually paid for 125, but he was double-crossed by the Dahomeyans, who frequently did this. They made Foster wait 8 days to get the people. He thought he'd be in and out of there in a day. And he started worrying he was being double-crossed. Sure enough, as the captives are being loaded onto the boat 8 days later, his lookout up in the crow's nest hollers out, "Ship ho," and they turn and they can see 2 British anti-slaving squadron steamships coming for him because the Dahomeyans have double-crossed him. So they cut the rope and leave the last canoe load of passengers and take off. And they outrun the slave ships because the Clotilda was so fast and flying extra sail. So we're back in America. I'm speeding up a little because I want to get to certain things. This is Cudjo with his wife. This is him at his well. At this point, he's 87 years old. He's lived a long, full life, but it's been a life alone. His family, he had 5 children, and his wife all died when he was about 60, and he lived into his 90s. This is his house. He and the other Africans built houses for each other. So after they were enslaved, they did what they had done throughout. The big thing about the Clotilda Africans is that they stuck together and they fought back. When most people were brought to this country, they went through slave markets and they were separated from anyone they knew. But the Clotilda group, because it was illegal to bring the ship in, Mayer couldn't take them to the slave market. So he spread them out and split them up with his brothers and a couple of their neighbors. So the people who were on board the Clotilda, many of whom were from the same village and had known each other all their lives, then spent a month in the Barracoon and then 2 months on the ship. By the time they get to America, they're a pretty tight group and they don't get broken up. So a couple of things happened during their captivity that talk to this point. One, and Cudjo talks about this one, there was an overseer out in the field who whipped one of the African women. And the Africans, all of them, men and women, attacked the overseer and took the whip from him and beat him with it until Mayer's other overseers were able to come rescue him. And then in Mayer's house, his wife had taken one of the little 12-year-old girls off the ship and wanted to make her a house servant. And so she had a hired cook named Aunt Polly, and she told Aunt Polly to teach her to sweep and do housework. Aunt Polly got frustrated because the girl wouldn't sweep right. Now, Africans know how to sweep. They swept their yards and stuff. And the girl was apparently a vigorous sweeper, and Aunt Polly didn't like that, I guess, because it was spreading dust too much. So she slapped the girl. We have this description from Mayor's houseboy who was in the house, a guy named Noah Hart. And Noah says the girl lets out a blood-curdling scream that raised goosebumps on his arm the size of potatoes. And then he heard the same call coming from the fields. And all the Africans who heard the call came running to the house, carrying the implements they were using to cut cane, harvest cotton, shovels, scythes, charged into the house, chased Mayor's wife and Aunt Polly upstairs where they locked themselves in a bedroom, and were out in the hall trained African warriors like Cujo, who was 19 when he was captured and been training for 5 years. And Noah says he thought they were going to kill him right then and there, and the situation was resolved. But that's the Africans. They fought back and they stuck together. Same thing after they were freed. They went to Mayor, and Cujo was the one they sent and said, give us some land. You stole us from our homeland. We can't get back there. We need a place to raise our families. This was a few weeks after the Civil War. One of the first instances of anyone asking for reparations in the country. Now, Mayor denied it, so Cujo says, we saved up our money, and they did this by working. Cujo worked for Mayor in his shingle factory, actually. And there was a gunpowder factory. They had all these factory jobs and stuff. And they saved up the money, and they started buying 2-acre plots from their former enslavers, Timothy Mayor, his brothers, and some of their neighbors. And before long, they had amassed quite a lot of property, and they took turns building each other's houses. Then they built a school. Then they built a church. Actually, they built the church first. But by 1900, Africatown, this community started by these slaves, former slaves, enslaved people in, about 1870, is the 4th largest community in America governed by African Americans. And it's attracting people like Booker T. Washington and Zora Neale Hurston. It was an incredible success story. This picture makes me so sad because in the corner, those are all the chairs for his 5 kids and his wife, and they're just stacked up with junk. This building still existed in 1992 when the city of Mobile and the state of Alabama tore it down to build a new hazardous waste route to get hazardous waste around Mobile on I-10. They tore down all the cabins built by the original founders in 1992, which is hard to believe. Their descendants, Cujo's great-great-grandson, was living in the house when they took it and destroyed it. They wiped out the original community. So now we're at the spot where I'm going to enter the story. This is a map of the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. If you've ever driven across toward Florida on I-10, you see Mobile Bay to the south and the swamp to the north. It's one of the largest wetland complexes in the U.S. Great place to hide a ship. I had been an investigative reporter in Mobile for 20 years and never once thought of looking for the Clotilda until a friend of mine called me up. He was a former reporter with me, and he said, I think you should look for the Clotilda. And I said, is it missing? And because I knew the story, you drive by this mural in Mobile that has the ship on it. So I knew, that Mobile was where the last ship carrying slaves came into America. But that's kind of where the story ended in my brain. He said, yeah, it's missing. And he told me the whole story of what had happened. Because it had been illegal to bring people in at the time, they couldn't just pull up to the dock. And then, because Timothy Mayor had a big mouth, from the moment the Clotilda left to go to Africa, he was blabbing to everybody in Mobile about what he was doing because he was so proud of it. He wanted to thumb his nose at the federal government. So within a week of the Clotilda leaving to go to Africa, there was an article in the newspaper saying the Clotilda has gone to Africa to come back with a load of captives. That article ran around the country because we had the telegraph. We didn't have wire services, but stories spread from newspaper to newspaper. So pretty soon, Timothy Mayor figures out the federal government's agents of the court are watching him at his house to see when the ship is coming back. So they had this elaborate plan where he was going to keep a lookout down on the coast in this secret place they were going to come in. But 3 months later, by the time the ship is coming back, the heat is on. And so Mayor wants nothing to do with it. So the Clotilda actually comes back and nobody meets it. It's in this remote area near Grand Bay, Alabama, for 3 days, with Foster going, where the heck is Mayor? He's supposed to show up with a steamboat and take these captives. Because the plan was Timothy was going to come in one of the steamboats, unload all the captives, and take them up and spread them to the plantations. Foster was going to sail the Clotilda to Mexico and have the ship redesigned so it looked different and give it a new name and pretend it was a new ship and not the Clotilda. But when the ship arrived, Foster, after 3 days, rode to shore, hiked to Bayou La Batterie, Alabama, borrowed a horse, rode to Mobile, told Timothy, hey, we're here. So they came down at night, they got the ship, they cut the masts off of it, they towed it all the way up into the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. And that's where the trail goes cold. We knew from Timothy Mayer telling this story over and over for the next 30 years. He was interviewed over and over and over about this as this swashbuckling captain. He was interviewed so many times. When he died, the New York Times wrote an obit saying the last slaver has died. So he tells this story in all these interviews. He said, oh yeah, we took the ship up to Bayou Combust and burned it. We took it to Bayou Corn and burned it. We took it to Bayou Connaught and burned it. These are all real places. But he names all these different places where, the ship has never been, was never found. People started looking for it. Federal government started looking for it the day it arrived. But it had been burned and sunk. People looked for it for the next 160 years. A famous historian in Mobile named Jack Friend spent tens of thousands of dollars of his own money hunting for the Clotilda, checking everywhere Timothy Mayer had said he burned it. And nobody ever found it. So my friend called me and told me to look for it. And I said, Jeff, that's just crazy. That's like looking for pirate treasure. People have looked for it. There's no way I'm going to find it. And he said, well, I don't know. You know the Delta pretty well. You run those nature tours up there. You've been writing about it for 20 years. You made a documentary about it and wrote a book about it. I figure if anybody has a chance of finding it, maybe it's you. So before we got off the phone, we got off the phone and I typed Clotilda into Google. And before I got up from the computer, I'd ordered all the relevant books and was totally captivated. And spent this was in August of 2017, I spent the next 4 months doing my research. And in that research, I came up with 2 things from people who were there that night telling me where the ship was burned. And this is one of them. This is Captain Foster's journal. He kept a very detailed journal when he went to Africa. It's 12 pages, it's handwritten. He describes all his negotiations with the Dahomeys and all that. But here, he describes when he burned the ship. And it's right here. He says, I took my schooner up to the Spanish River into the Alabama River at 12 Mile Island. I transferred my slaves to a river steamboat and sent them up into the canebrake to hide them until further disposal. I then burned my schooner to the water's edge and sunk her. And he's telling us right there at 12 Mile Island. He's saying that's where he did it. Timothy Mayer never said a word about 12 Mile Island. He talked about all these other places, many of which I knew couldn't be true because the bodies of water weren't big enough to handle an ocean-going ship, let alone a steamboat big enough to carry 110 captives. So I had that. Then I found an interview with Cujo Lewis from the late 1800s. And in it, he says they burned the ship at 12 Mile Island. Now, the night they came in, he didn't know what 12 Mile Island was. He'd never seen America. But during his 5 years of captivity, he worked on Mayer's steamboats. And they went up and down the rivers the whole time. Now, this is one of the ways the Clotilda passengers were able to keep in touch while they were captives, because there were a group of them that worked the steamboats with Cujo. And so they would go to all the plantations where the rest of the group was, and they would exchange news and talk and keep in touch. So in this interview, he says they burned it at 12 Mile Island. And I thought, So when Cujo's 87 years old and Zora Neale Hurston interviews him, he lists the 21 landings they would stop at up the Mobile River in perfect order. So I thought, all right, he knows the river. And then there's this other detail. The night that they were brought into the country, one of the men driving one of the steamboats was a Cherokee who was enslaved by the Mayers named James Dennison. They had taught James to drive steamboats. He drove the steamboat with the captives on it the night they came back to the country. Then he married one of the African women, and he and Cujo were friends for the rest of their lives. So there's no way James, who was there that night, didn't tell Cujo 12 Mile Island. So now I had 2 sources telling me 12 Mile Island. This is that area up the river. It's very remote, swampy. So I went out there on January 2nd, 2018, we had a big, cold north wind blowing. The water in Mobile Bay was about 4 feet lower than normal. It was same up in the swamp. I went up there and I found this, which was a schooner. From the 1850s. We could tell by the construction techniques. I brought archaeologists up. I brought shipwrights up, people who build wooden ships. Everybody said, this might be Clotilda. I wrote a story that said, wreck found by reporter may be the last slave ship. The story went viral all around the world. And I know how viral because 2 days afterward, the ambassador of Benin flew down from Washington, D.C., to have me take him up to the ship at the behest of his president, so that he could do a vote-on ceremony to ask the people who were on the Clotilda to forgive the people of Benin for deporting them. So 2 days after, the story's gone, international. So 2 months later, a group of archaeologists from all over the world come, the Slave Wrecks Project, the National Park Service, the Smithsonian, all these different entities, and investigate my ship and figure out what the headline says, wreck found by reporter, not the Clotilda. It was too big, it was too long. There was a bunch of it buried in the mud, and on January 2nd, it was 27 degrees and we weren't diving. So these guys came and we got in the river and we figured out it was not the Clotilda. So they announced this at a meeting in Africatown. The day that the first story came out, when there was a meeting in Africatown they invited me to, people were cheering. They had T-shirts made that said, "Our ship has come in." Africatown was very excited because the people of Mobile for 100 years had been kind of poo-pooing the whole Clotilda story, saying there's no ship, you guys made that up, you're not the last people brought in the country, and all that. So hearing the archaeologists say it's not the Clotilda, many people in the room didn't believe them. And they assumed it was a trick by the government of Alabama, the state government, which is a long and storied racial past, was lying to them. But, I knew the ship was too big and everything. So I walked out of the meeting pretty crestfallen, feeling like I am going to go home and drink whiskey and I am not going to look for the Clotilda ever again. And a woman came up to me, one of the Descendants, and gave me a big hug. And she sang a gospel song in my ear. And the song is called "There's a Bright Side Somewhere." And the lyrics are, "There's a bright side somewhere, don't stop until you find it." And so she sang the song to me and then pushed me back and held me by the shoulders and looked me right in the eye and said, "Don't give up, Ben. Keep looking for it. You're going to find it." And she said, "Nobody else is looking." And so I turned away from her and walked about 5 or 10 feet to these two guys who were marine archaeologists, who came up and introduced themselves to me. And I knew who they were because they had found a ship from the 1700s, a Dutch ship, a few years before in the Gulf of Mexico. And they said, "Look, we think you're right. We think Timothy Mayer lied about all those places he said where the ship was. We got hired by the state of Alabama to go find these 2 Civil War ironclads, Confederate warships, that were intentionally sunk in the Mobile River the day Mobile fell. So we found them both the first day. They were right where they said they were. So then we had 5 days of ship time to do a search. So we searched all of the Mobile River south of 12 Mile Island. So they used modern equipment, which is a sub-bottom profiler, a side scan sonar. So the sub-bottom profiler looks under the mud in the river bottom. The side scan looks on top of the mud for objects laying there or ships. And then a magnetometer that looks for metal. And these ships had massive amounts of metal. So they told me, "Look, we did a professional search south of 12 Mile Island, and I knew that historian had done north of 12 Mile Island. Nobody had ever searched 12 Mile Island, the one place I had 2 people who were there that night saying the ship was." So I said, "All right, I know what I'm going to do. I am going to conduct the first ever modern survey of 12 Mile Island with all these machines I just described." Now, a boat equipped with those machines is about $250,000 and about $10,000 a day to rent. So I called the head of marine resources or marine studies at the University of Southern Mississippi, just down the road, a guy named Monty Graham, who I'd known for years. And I knew that Southern Miss had a boat with all this equipment because they trained students to go work in the oil industry on the boat. So I said, "Monty, would you guys bring your survey boat over here and try and help me find the Clotilda?" And he said, "Well, what's your budget?" And I said, "I have absolutely no money." And he laughed and said, "Okay, we'll do it." And he said, "It'll be good practice for the grad students, and I'd like to help Africatown." So they came over 1 week after this meeting where they said it wasn't the Clotilda. We went up there and used all that equipment. You tow it behind the boat, and it feeds into about 4 laptops. They had about 10 people on the boat, all technicians, gathering all this data. Then they took that data back, and a week later they had produced a map of the river bottom. And it's kind of like a topographic map with those rings, to show height, but a marine survey map like this is done in colors. So different colors are different depths. So we went back out with the map of the river. We had 11 possible targets. One of them was the Clotilda, we could tell. You could see the deck. It was exactly, it was like 88 feet long, 25, 26 feet wide, the exact dimensions of the Clotilda. You could see the hatches missing on the deck. You could see planks where they had gone. We went to that ship first. Dive gear, roll off the boat. Instantly knew it wasn't the Clotilda because the only thing made of wood on it was that deck. The hull was made of iron. We had found basically a duckbill platypus. There are some very rare ships that were built in the Edwardian era just for a few years because they sucked. And this one was one of them. It was an iron-hulled sailboat. It was right at that transition time between steam to sail, and so they built these, but they were terrible because they would sink because they were made of iron. So we happened to find one. So then we checked the other 10 targets on the map, and none of them were the Clotilda. They were either too big, too small, or made of metal. So we're at the end of the day. This was April 9th. Everybody's packing their gear up for the run back to the dock, and I'm lingering over the map on my phone. I'm staring at it because I'm the one who's been, internationally humiliated for not finding the ship. So I'm buzzing through it. We had a guy who owns a dive shop on the boat as our dive safety officer. He's looking over my shoulder, and he points at the screen and says, "What's that?" And I say, "I don't know. It looks like a shoe." And we're talking about a shape on the thing. And he says, "Not to me. That looks like a ship. Let's go there." So we call back to the lab in Mississippi. They work up the coordinates for the shoe, and we go to the shoe. But nobody else will get in the water because it's cold. Putting on a wetsuit in 50-degree weather and 50-degree water is just not, it's miserable. But again, the international humiliation was a good motivator. So I'm in the water, and I'm diving down, and I keep coming up with logs and swimming them out of the way. And they're making fun of me on the boat. "Oh, you found a pile of firewood," and stuff like that. And so then I'm down there, and I feel something that I can tell is hewn lumber. It's a squared off piece of wood that's been cut. And I tug on it a little bit, and it comes away in my hand. And I swim up, and this is it. This is the first piece of Clotilda to see the light of day. You see that big iron nail coming out of it. These ships were put together with blacksmith nails. You see the striations in there? You can tell this is a handmade nail from a ship from the 1850s. And we could tell it had been burned. The wood bore signs of having been on fire, just like the Clotilda. This is Monty, the Mississippi guy, just so y'all can see him. And here, we're going to see the Clotilda. It's going to come into view here. This is actually on my depth finder on my boat. This is a new depth finder. I've had it about 3 months. If I had this when I was looking for the ship, I would have found it like that. There it is. That is the Clotilda right there. This is the bow coming here in the point. You see the sides going up. And that area right in the middle, it's moving around a lot, right there, that's where the people were. Now it's stopped. All right. So the ship is laying there still on the bottom. You notice it's full of mud. Mud is excellent. Mud is like a time capsule. The contents of the ship are hermetically sealed. The archaeologists have described it as the most intact slave ship ever found, and it is. There have only been 13 found in the global slave trade out of 20,000 ships that were used. This is the only one found involved in the American trade, and it's the only one that is still intact. The piece of a slave ship in the Smithsonian Museum in D.C. is it's about this big. It's from a South African ship that sank in port in Brazil. This is an internationally important artifact. And coupled with they had a big party, incidentally, coupled with having the story of the people who were on board the ship. There's no record like this anywhere in the history. This is Dada Dagbo Hunenhuli. He is the he is the most high-ranking Vodun person on earth. He's basically the Pope of Vodun. So the government sent him here to come worry over the ship and do a ceremony over the ship. Which was fascinating. The ambassador, when the ambassador came, he also did a Vodun ceremony. And it involved gin, his ceremony. He would drink the gin and then spew it in the water and then yell. First he was talking, then he ended up yelling at the water with tears streaming down his face. And he's speaking Fon, and I can't understand what he's saying. So I asked him afterward. And that night at dinner, he told me what happened. He said, "I was asking my mother's ancestors," his mother was a Yoruba, "to forgive my father's ancestors. My father is Fon. He was a Dahomey. I am a prince of Dahomey." He says, "I am a direct descendant of King Glele who sold these people. So I'm asking my mother's people to forgive my father's people for selling her family." And you could see this battle inside him. He's there crying on the boat. So this has been going on in Benin. So Dada Dagbo does the ceremony. He makes me a son of the sea. He gives me one of the strands of the beads. Incidentally, his business card describes him as the king of oceans and seas, which is part of his Vodun title, and he's a lawyer and a labor negotiator. So it's quite a portfolio. He invited me to come to Benin, so I went, and this is customs, and I'm about to go through. Now, I knew from the ambassador, because you remember Donald Trump's, I don't want to say it, S-hole country comment? He was talking about Benin, literally talking about Benin, because the ambassador was standing outside the Oval Office waiting to go in to talk to him. And so this was well known in Benin. I'm about to get the hook. So I know this. So I go up to this guy. He looks at my passport. He says, États-Unis? I said, oui. And he says, Trump. And so I did this. And he says, bienvenue à Benin, and invites me in. This is the view from the pool up on the roof. And this is the view looking over the edge of the roof. This is Cotonou, the main city in Benin. This was a guy, I'm trying to get to something. This is a gas station, incidentally. The bottles are for the motorcycles. The big ones are for cars. I never saw a pump. Street scene in Dahomey. Market scene in Bohican, where several of the Clotilda passengers were from. And then this is a tree built on the site where the white building was, where Cujo was hidden under the building. Then you see this. They still worship, the Vodun people still worship all the kings. You see King Gizu and King Glele. They're still worshipped in the country, and they're revered as both historical figures, but also religious figures. But then, and this is King Glele, to the modern King Glele. This is the last living grandson of Glele that sold the people on the Clotilda. And we went and met with him. You have to crawl into the throne room on hands and knees, and you can't get up until he tells you can get up. And then we sit down, and then they came around and gave us all tumblers, and they poured water out of a pitcher into the tumblers. Now in Benin, in Africa in general, you don't drink water unless you take the top off a plastic bottle. And so here we are, confronted with water that is of unknown origin in the throne room, in the palace in Dahomey, where Cujo and all the others were taken. And I thought, am I going to drink this water? But I knew historically, in Dahomey, in the court of Dahomey, if you were served water, it was a sign that no treachery was going to befall you. So I drank the water, and then we drank Johnny Walker Black out of the tumblers. And it was a great time. I did ask King Glele, I said, so is it true? And he said, what true? I said, is it good to be king? And he said, oh, yes, it is good to be king. So you see these Vodun statues all around, but then you see things like this. This is the gate of no return. But look at the art on it. It's captives. You know, they're bound, they're gagged. This is public art there. Look at this. Can you imagine seeing this in downtown Jackson? And we did this here. What Dada Dagbo said to me is, I'm so proud of my country. We're not hiding from this legacy. We know what happened here, and we're trying to make amends. And, that reconciliation is so important and powerful. You see statues like this. This is a faceless person to represent all the people lost to slavery. And then statues like this to shame the Fon, the Dahomeyans, for their role, looking down and away in shame. And then statues like this of liberation. I'm at the time limit. Do we need to stop? All right, do we have time for questions? I'm happy to answer any questions if we have permission.
Yeah, well, I know that we have lots of questions. We don't have time, and I'm sorry about that. The good news is we got the books right over here, and I bet that Ben will answer any question that you have in line here. Don't forget as well that this weekend is the Mississippi Book Festival, and Ben will be at that on Saturday. I hope that we'll see you all there. Don't forget our upcoming programs. Come back next week for William Thompson's History is Lunch. Help me thank Ben Raines for this program today.